My sister chose Grandpa over Dad to walk her down the aisle. What happened next exposed our family's darkest truths. From the outside, our family looked ordinary, even enviable. We lived in a cozy suburban house with a neatly mowed lawn and a family dog that barked too much at the mailman. To anyone passing by, we were just another happy, functional family. But behind closed doors, the reality was much different. Our parents weren't abusive or outwardly cruel. They were indifferent, which in some ways was worse. Dad's presence in our lives was more of a technicality than a reality. He was always there physically, planted on his recliner with the TV remote in one hand and his phone in the other. But emotionally, he might as well have been on another planet. Mom was no better. She wasn't the kind of parent who yelled or nagged or got overly involved in our lives. If anything, she was the opposite. Her energy was spent on maintaining appearances, chasing the approval of her friends, running errands for events that didn't matter, and scrolling endlessly through her social media feeds. We were just another bullet point in the long list of things she had to manage, somewhere between her yoga classes and PTA meetings. My sister Elena, being the oldest, experienced this neglect in full force before I was even old enough to notice it. As a little girl, she idolized our parents. She was desperate to win their attention and approval. She worked hard in school, excelled in sports, and did everything she could to make them proud. But no matter what she achieved, it was never enough. Her A's on report cards were met with a distracted "good job, sweetie." Her victories on the soccer field barely earned her a glance from Dad as he checked the game scores on his phone. Even when she performed in the school play and nailed her part as the lead, Mom spent more time whispering to the other moms in the audience than actually watching Elena on stage. I remember watching her fight for their attention, trying to understand why their smiles never seemed to reach their eyes when they looked at her. At the time, I didn't understand what she was going through. As the younger sibling, I had my own quiet struggles, but Elena's were so much louder, more visible. Eventually, she stopped trying. By the time Elena hit her teenage years, the fight for their approval had burned out of her completely. She poured herself into her friends, her hobbies, and most importantly, our grandpa. Grandpa, my mom's father, was the only adult in our lives who truly saw Elena. While Mom and Dad were busy with their own distractions, Grandpa was at every soccer game, every school recital, every event that mattered to her. He sat in the front row with a proud smile, cheering louder than anyone else when she scored a goal or hit a high note. When Elena failed her first math test in 7th grade, she was terrified of how Dad would react. But it wasn't Dad who sat her down and told her it was okay, who spent hours helping her understand fractions and decimals. It was Grandpa. When she sprained her ankle at practice, it was Grandpa who drove her to the hospital and stayed by her side, even as our parents brushed it off as not a big deal. The bond they shared was unshakable. Grandpa became the father figure Elena had never had, the one who celebrated her successes and comforted her during her failures. He filled a void our parents either couldn't see or didn't care to address. I watched from the sidelines, both grateful and envious. Grateful that Elena had someone in her corner, but envious that I didn't have the same connection. Grandpa tried to reach out to me, too, but I was quieter than Elena, more withdrawn. Where she poured her heart out to him, I held mine back, unsure of how to open up. By the time Elena graduated high school, the rift between her and our parents was undeniable. They hadn't shown up for her senior awards ceremony, claiming they were too busy. When she got a scholarship to a great university, Dad barely acknowledged it, muttering something about how she'd better not waste it. Mom's only concern was whether Elena's roommate would be a good influence. But Grandpa? He was beaming with pride. He helped her pack for college, gave her heartfelt advice, and promised to visit her as often as he could. When she moved into her dorm, he was the one who stayed behind to make sure her bed was made and her books were organized, while Mom and Dad left after snapping a quick photo for Facebook. College gave Elena the distance she needed to thrive. Away from our parents' indifference, she blossomed into the confident, capable person she was always meant to be. She built a life for herself, one that didn't rely on their approval or attention. Years passed, and while my parents' relationship with Elena grew more strained, her bond with Grandpa only deepened. He visited her on campus, sent her care packages filled with her favorite snacks, and called her every week to check in. He even helped her navigate her first job offer, guiding her through salary negotiations and contract details. Our dad, on the rare occasions he mentioned Elena, spoke about her with a mix of indifference and bitterness. He didn't understand her success, and in some twisted way, it seemed to remind him of his own failures as a parent. Mom, ever the socialite, only seemed interested in Elena's life when it could serve as fodder for her online posts. When Elena got engaged, their reactions were predictable. Dad barely glanced up from his phone, muttering a distracted, "That's great, kiddo." Mom's first question was about the guest list, her mind already spinning with ideas for a picture-perfect wedding. Grandpa's reaction, however, was everything Elena needed. He pulled her into a hug, his face lighting up with pride and joy. He gushed about how lucky her fiancé Mark was to have her, and how proud he was of the woman she had become. It was no surprise, then, when Elena made a decision that would shake our family to its core. After years of neglect and indifference from our parents, she asked Grandpa, not Dad, to walk her down the aisle. Elena's decision to have Grandpa walk her down the aisle was as bold as it was inevitable. For years, he had been the only consistent source of love and support in her life, the one person who had always shown up for her. It wasn't just a choice, it was a statement, a recognition of everything Grandpa had done and, by contrast, everything our parents hadn't. She didn't make the announcement with fanfare or drama. She simply told the family one evening during a casual dinner at Grandpa's house, her tone calm but firm. Grandpa's eyes glistened with emotion, his gratitude unspoken but unmistakable. Our parents' reactions, on the other hand, were anything but subtle. Mom froze, her fork hovering midair as the meaning of Elena's words sank in. For a moment, she looked as though she might dismiss it as a joke, her forced smile faltering. When she realized Elena was serious, her expression hardened into something between disbelief and indignation. Dad, true to form, didn't react immediately. He continued eating, his face a mask of indifference. But the slight tightening of his jaw betrayed his emotions. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was something colder, quieter, and far more cutting. For a while, the room was silent, the tension palpable. Then Mom broke the silence with a strained comment about tradition and how it was expected for a father to walk his daughter down the aisle. Her words were carefully chosen, designed to guilt rather than accuse, but Elena didn't flinch. Elena calmly explained her reasons, speaking with a clarity that left no room for argument. She didn't lash out or dredge up the past. She simply stated the truth. Grandpa had been there for her in ways our parents never had. He had earned the honor of walking her down the aisle, and she wasn't going to let outdated expectations dictate her choice. Mom's protests grew louder, her voice tinged with desperation as she tried to frame Elena's decision as an attack on the family. Dad finally spoke, his tone dismissive as he muttered something about how it didn't matter to him anyway. But his words rang hollow. The tension in his shoulders, the way he avoided eye contact. It was clear that her decision stung more than he would ever admit. For the next few weeks, the household became a battleground of passive-aggressive comments and thinly veiled guilt trips. Mom alternated between pleading with Elena to reconsider and complaining to anyone who would listen about how ungrateful she was being. Dad retreated further into his usual indifference, his silence heavy with unspoken resentment. Grandpa, for his part, tried to smooth things over. He told Elena he didn't want to cause a rift in the family and even suggested that she let Dad walk her down the aisle instead. But Elena stood her ground. This wasn't about creating conflict. It was about honoring the person who had truly been there for her. The fallout wasn't limited to the immediate family. Word of Elena's decision spread quickly, thanks in no small part to Mom's tendency to vent to her friends. Soon, extended relatives and family acquaintances were weighing in, their opinions divided. Some supported Elena, praising her for choosing someone who had genuinely earned the role. Others criticized her, parroting Mom's claims about tradition and family loyalty. As the wedding date drew closer, the tension reached a boiling point. Mom and Dad became increasingly distant, their disapproval manifesting in subtle but unmistakable ways. They contributed less and less to the wedding planning, their offers of help dwindling to nothing. At one point, Mom even suggested she might not attend the ceremony at all, though Elena shrugged it off as an empty threat. I found myself caught in the middle of the storm. My relationship with Elena had always been strong, but navigating the family politics around her decision was exhausting. I supported her choice wholeheartedly. She had every right to honor Grandpa in this way, but I also couldn't ignore the emotional toll it was taking on everyone involved. The tension reached its peak at a family gathering a few weeks before the wedding. Mom cornered me in the kitchen, her voice low and urgent as she vented about how hurt she and Dad felt. She claimed that Elena's decision was tearing the family apart, that it was selfish and unfair. I tried to reason with her, explaining that this wasn't about them. It was about Elena and her relationship with Grandpa. But my words fell on deaf ears. Mom was too entrenched in her own narrative, too focused on the perceived slight to see the bigger picture. Elena, meanwhile, remained resolute. She spent those weeks finalizing the details of the ceremony, pouring her energy into creating a day that reflected her and Mark's love story. She leaned heavily on Grandpa during this time, their bond growing even stronger as they worked together to prepare for the big day. The closer we got to the wedding, the more I admired Elena's strength. She wasn't just standing up for herself. She was reclaiming her story, choosing to honor the person who had truly shaped her life. But even as the wedding day approached, there was an undercurrent of tension, a lingering question about how our parents would handle their wounded pride. I couldn't help but wonder if their resentment would overshadow the day itself, or if, against all odds, they would find a way to set it aside. What none of us realized was that there was one final twist waiting to reveal itself, one that would shake the foundations of our already fractured family dynamic. As the wedding day drew closer, the tension within the family reached an unbearable pitch. The silent disapproval from Mom and Dad had morphed into something colder, sharper. Their contributions to the wedding planning had dwindled to token gestures, and they no longer even pretended to be interested in the details. Elena, however, remained unfazed. She poured herself into finalizing every aspect of the ceremony, determined to make it a day that celebrated her and Mark's love story. Grandpa was by her side for all of it, from cake tastings to venue walkthroughs. They were an inseparable duo, their bond growing stronger with every passing day. But the closer we got to the wedding, the more I noticed cracks forming beneath Mom and Dad's stoic exterior. Dad became more withdrawn, spending hours in his recliner with the TV on, but the sound muted, staring at his phone with a furrowed brow. Mom, on the other hand, oscillated between thinly veiled hostility and attempts at guilt-laden manipulation. One evening, while Elena and I were catching up at her apartment, she revealed something that had been weighing on her. Mom had sent her a long, rambling email the night before, accusing her of disrespecting the family and humiliating Dad by asking Grandpa to walk her down the aisle. The email ended with a subtle threat. If Elena didn't reconsider, Mom and Dad might not attend the wedding at all. Elena shrugged as she told me, but I could see the hurt beneath her calm exterior. For all her strength and independence, a part of her had always hoped that our parents would come around, that they would finally see her for who she was and offer her the support she deserved. They won't really skip the wedding, I said, trying to reassure her. They'd never make it that obvious. But as the days passed, the tension only escalated. Mom stopped responding to Elena's texts and calls, and Dad avoided any mention of the wedding altogether. It was as though they were silently daring her to beg for their approval, to reverse her decision and restore the status quo. The breaking point came during the rehearsal dinner. The dinner was held at a charming little restaurant just outside the city, a cozy space filled with soft candlelight and the hum of quiet conversation. Mark's family had flown in from out of town, and the room buzzed with warmth and excitement as everyone gathered to celebrate the couple. Grandpa was seated next to Elena, beaming with pride as he shared stories about her childhood with Mark's family. Every now and then, he would place a reassuring hand on her shoulder or lean in to whisper something that made her laugh. Mom and Dad arrived late, their entrance subdued but noticeable. They took their seats at the far end of the table, exchanging curt hellos but otherwise keeping to themselves. The air around them was icy, their presence a stark contrast to the joy and celebration that filled the room. As the night went on, the tension grew heavier. Mom's forced smile barely masked her irritation, and Dad seemed determined to stay glued to his phone, only glancing up when someone directly addressed him. And then it happened. As the server cleared the plates and the conversation turned to toasts, Grandpa stood up. He raised his glass, his voice steady but filled with emotion, and began to speak. He talked about how proud he was of Elena, how he had watched her grow into the incredible woman she had become. She's always been strong, always been resilient, he said, his eyes shining. But more than that, she's kind. She's the kind of person who makes you believe the world is a better place just because she's in it. And Mark, you're a lucky man to have her by your side. The room erupted into applause, but not everyone was clapping. Mom's expression twisted into something sharp and bitter, her forced smile vanishing entirely. She leaned toward Dad, whispering something under her breath, and he nodded in agreement. Then, to everyone's shock, they stood up and walked out of the room without a word. The room fell silent as the door swung shut behind them. For a moment, no one knew what to say. The tension hung heavy in the air, a painful reminder of the rift that had been growing for years. Elena, to her credit, didn't flinch. She straightened her posture, raised her glass, and thanked Grandpa for his beautiful toast, seamlessly steering the conversation back to the celebration. But I could see the hurt flicker across her face, a flash of pain that she quickly buried beneath her composure. Later that night, as the guests trickled out and the restaurant emptied, I found Elena sitting alone on the patio, staring out at the twinkling lights of the city. I sat down beside her, unsure of what to say. "They've always been like this," she said after a long pause. "But I guess I thought maybe this time would be different." I didn't have an answer for her. How could I? Our parents had made their choice, and it was clear where their priorities lay. But what none of us realized at that moment was that their dramatic exit wasn't the end of the conflict. It was only the beginning of something far more revealing, something that would finally force us all to confront the truth about our family. The morning after the rehearsal dinner was oppressive with tension. The weight of what had happened the night before hung over us like a storm cloud, a sharp reminder of how deeply fractured our family had become. Mom and Dad's dramatic exit wasn't just a petty act of defiance. It was a deliberate declaration of their disapproval, a way of showing Elena and the rest of us exactly where they stood. Elena threw herself into the last-minute wedding preparations, determined to push forward despite the lingering hurt. She focused on the things she could control, finalizing the seating chart, double-checking the ceremony details, and coordinating with vendors. Mark stayed by her side the entire time, offering quiet reassurances and keeping her grounded. But even as she smiled and reassured everyone that things were fine, I could see the cracks beneath her surface. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked, and her laughter felt forced, as though she were trying to convince herself that everything was okay. Meanwhile, Mom and Dad were conspicuously absent. They hadn't reached out since leaving the rehearsal dinner, and their silence felt like a challenge, a way of daring Elena to beg for their forgiveness. That afternoon, as I sat scrolling through my phone, a notification popped up that made my stomach drop. It was a post from Mom's social media account, and the caption stopped me cold. "Sometimes you have to celebrate your own milestones. Putting yourself first is always the right choice. #FamilyFirst, #making memories." The picture showed Mom and Dad at a fancy restaurant, raising glasses of wine with exaggerated smiles. Their posturing was so absurd it would have been laughable if it weren't so infuriating. While the rest of us were cleaning up the emotional fallout of their tantrum, they were busy playing the role of perfect parents online. But what really caught my attention were the comments. Beneath the post were dozens of replies from Mom's friends, each one dripping with validation and support. "You're so brave," one comment read. "Some people don't appreciate everything their parents do for them," another said. "They'll regret it one day." I scrolled through the replies, my anger building with every passing moment. It was clear that Mom had been spinning her version of the events leading up to the wedding, framing herself and Dad as the victims. Fueled by a mix of frustration and curiosity, I clicked on her profile and started scrolling through her recent posts. What I found was worse than I had imagined. Over the past few weeks, Mom had been waging a quiet but deliberate campaign against Elena. Her posts ranged from subtle digs about family loyalty to outright jabs about how traditions matter. In one particularly pointed post, she shared a picture of Dad with the caption, "A real father is there for his children, no matter what. Hashtag true father, hashtag unbreakable bond." The comments on that post were even more venomous, with some of Mom's friends openly criticizing Elena. Words like selfish and ungrateful appeared again and again, each one a dagger aimed at her character. It wasn't just petty, it was cruel. Mom wasn't just upset about Elena's decision to have Grandpa walk her down the aisle. She was actively trying to turn the narrative against her, casting herself and Dad as the long-suffering parents of a difficult daughter. My hands shook as I stared at the screen. This wasn't just an overreaction to a single decision. This was a deliberate attempt to undermine Elena on one of the most important days of her life. I debated whether to tell Elena what I had found. She was already carrying so much, and the last thing I wanted was to add more stress. But as I watched her work tirelessly to ensure every detail of the wedding was perfect, I knew she deserved to know the truth. That evening, I sat her down and showed her the posts. Her reaction was a mix of hurt and resignation. She scrolled through the posts in silence, her expression carefully neutral, but I could see the pain in her eyes. "They've always been like this," she said quietly, setting the phone down. "I guess I just hoped they'd put it aside for one day." I didn't know what to say. How do you comfort someone who's spent their entire life trying to earn the approval of people who only know how to disappoint? The next day, the tension came to a head. Grandpa, who had heard about Mom and Dad's behavior from one of the other relatives at the rehearsal dinner, decided to confront them directly. He showed up at their house unannounced, hoping to talk some sense into them before the wedding. What happened during that conversation, none of us could have predicted. Later that evening, Grandpa called me and asked to meet in person. His voice was calm but serious, and there was a weight to his tone that made me uneasy. When I arrived at his house, he was sitting at the kitchen table with a file of papers in front of him. "I need to tell you something," he said, gesturing for me to sit. He explained that during his conversation with Mom and Dad, they had let something slip, something that cast their entire relationship with Elena in a new, heartbreaking light. It turned out that years ago, when Elena was just a child, Dad had tried to convince Grandpa to stop being so involved in her life. He saw Grandpa's attention and support as a threat, a reminder of the things he couldn't provide as a father. Mom had gone along with it, enabling Dad's insecurity and even making subtle comments to Grandpa about boundaries. But Grandpa had refused to step back. He saw what Elena was going through, how much she needed someone to fill the void our parents had left. And so, he doubled down, becoming the father figure she deserved. Hearing this left me reeling. It explained so much. The simmering resentment Dad always seemed to carry, the way Mom clung to appearances while ignoring what really mattered. They had seen Grandpa's love for Elena not as a gift, but as a threat to their fragile egos. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Mom and Dad's behavior wasn't just about the wedding. It was a culmination of years of bitterness and insecurity, of choices made out of pride rather than love. As Grandpa handed me the papers, a collection of old letters and emails that confirmed everything he had said, I felt a wave of anger and sadness crash over me. For so long, I had hoped that our family could heal, that there was some way to bridge the divide. But now I wasn't so sure. The morning of Elena's wedding arrived, bright and clear, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. For weeks, the family drama had loomed over every conversation, every detail of the event, casting a shadow on what should have been a joyful occasion. But Elena, ever the resilient one, was determined to make it her day, no matter what. She spent the morning surrounded by her bridal party, laughing and chatting as they helped her prepare. Her dress was stunning, classic yet modern, a reflection of her strength and grace. Grandpa arrived early, wearing a perfectly tailored suit and holding a small bouquet of wildflowers for her. His presence was a steadying force, a reminder that she wasn't alone. Mom and Dad were late. Their arrival was as understated as it was calculated. They slipped into the ceremony venue moments before it began, avoiding eye contact with everyone as they quietly took seats in the back row. It was clear that their presence wasn't about support. It was about being seen, about maintaining the illusion of involvement without actually engaging. As the ceremony began, the atmosphere shifted. The soft music, the delicate floral arrangements, and the palpable love between Elena and Mark transformed the space into something sacred. Grandpa stood by her side at the top of the aisle, his hand steady on her arm. When the doors opened and they began their walk down the aisle, time seemed to stand still. The love and pride radiating from Grandpa were undeniable, and Elena's smile, radiant and unshaken, lit up the entire room. I watched from my seat, my heart swelling with pride for her. This moment wasn't just about her marriage. It was a declaration of her resilience, her ability to rise above the neglect and bitterness of our parents and create a life on her own terms. But as I glanced at Mom and Dad, I saw something else entirely. Mom's expression was tight, her lips pressed into a thin line as she stared straight ahead. Dad's face was unreadable, his eyes fixed on the floor. They didn't clap or smile like the rest of the guests when Grandpa handed Elena to Mark at the altar. The ceremony went off without a hitch, every moment filled with warmth and genuine emotion. But as the guests filtered into the reception hall, the tension bubbled back to the surface. It didn't take long for the confrontation to come. Halfway through the reception, during the lull between the first dances and dinner, Mom approached Elena. I watched from a distance as the two of them spoke in hushed tones near the edge of the dance floor. It was clear from Elena's posture, straight, unwavering, that she wasn't backing down. Mom's expression grew, increasingly agitated, her hands gesturing sharply as she spoke. Whatever she was saying, it wasn't an apology. Minutes later, Elena walked away, her face set in a mask of calm determination. Mom, meanwhile, stormed back to the table where Dad sat, her anger radiating off her like heat. Elena joined me at the bar, her hands shaking slightly as she picked up a glass of champagne. She said I humiliated them, she said, her voice low but steady, that I've been ungrateful my whole life and that this is the ultimate betrayal. I felt my chest tighten with anger. What did you say? I asked. I told her that she and Dad made their choices a long time ago, Elena said, taking a sip of her champagne. And now, I'm making mine. Her words were simple, but the weight behind them was immense. For years, she had carried the burden of their neglect, their expectations, and their manipulations. But now, she was finally putting it down. As the evening went on, the divide between Elena and our parents became impossible to ignore. They stayed in their corner of the room, speaking only to each other and a handful of distant relatives who seemed more interested in avoiding drama than addressing it. Grandpa, meanwhile, was the life of the party. He danced with Elena during the father-daughter dance, his movements clumsy but joyful, and gave a toast that left the entire room in tears. When the night came to an end and the guests began trickling out, Elena and I sat together for a quiet moment. The weight of the day, the emotions, and the family drama finally caught up to her, and for the first time, I saw tears in her eyes. They're never going to change, are they? She said softly. I didn't have an answer. The weeks following the wedding were quiet, almost unnervingly so. Mom and Dad didn't reach out, and Elena didn't make any effort to contact them either. It was as though the divide had finally become permanent, a silent acknowledgement that neither side was willing to bridge the gap. Grandpa, ever the optimist, tried to keep the peace in his own quiet way. He encouraged Elena to focus on her new life with Mark, reminding her that family wasn't always about blood. It was about the people who showed up for you, who loved you without conditions or expectations. As for me, I stayed close to Elena, offering her support as she navigated the complicated emotions of letting go. The bitterness toward our parents didn't disappear overnight, but it lessened with time, replaced by a quiet acceptance of the reality we had always known. Elena's wedding wasn't just the start of her marriage. It was the start of a new chapter for all of us. It was a moment of clarity, a reminder that love and loyalty are earned, not given freely. And as I watched her flourish in her new life, supported by Grandpa and surrounded by people who truly valued her, I knew she had made the right choice.